Imagine you had to build your home today, from scratch, using only what you could find within walking distance. No hardware store, no lumber yard, no power tools, no permits, no mortgage. Just you, your group, and whatever the landscape provides. How long would it take? Weeks? Months? A lifetime of saving? For a prehistoric hunter-gatherer, the answer was about an hour. An hour. And the result was a fully functional home, dry, warm enough, safe enough, comfortable enough to sleep in that night. To us, that sounds impossibly primitive. A hut of sticks and grass thrown together in an afternoon. But today I want to convince you of something surprising. That 1-hour house was not a sign of failure or poverty. It was one of the most brilliant pieces of engineering logic in human history, and the fact that they could have built something permanent, but chose not to, reveals a profound intelligence about how to live. Let's build a prehistoric home together, and then let's ask why they didn't build a better one. A prehistoric hunter-gatherer could build a functional home in about an hour. This was not primitive. It was genius. Let's start with the actual construction. How do you build a shelter in an hour? We have remarkably good information about this because a handful of hunter-gatherer societies were building these shelters into the 20th century and beyond, and anthropologists watched them do it, timed them, and documented every step. Take the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. Anthropologist James Woodburn, who lived among them for years, documented that it takes Hadza women less than 2 hours to build an entire new camp. Not one hut, a whole camp. A single dwelling can go up in about an hour. Here's how it works. First, the frame. You gather flexible branches and saplings, green wood that bends without breaking. You push the thick ends into the ground in a rough circle, then bend the tops inward and weave them together, creating a domed lattice about 6 feet high. This is the skeleton of the house. Then, the covering. You layer grass, leaves, and smaller branches over the frame, thatching it thickly enough to shed rain and block wind. In the dry season, the covering is lighter, just enough for shade and privacy. In colder or wetter conditions, it's packed denser. And that's it. Frame and thatch. A dome of woven branches clothed in grass. A home. The recipe? Bend saplings into a domed frame, weave them together, thatch with grass. Frame and covering. That's the entire house. Now the materials. This is where the genius starts to show. Every single material in that house came from within a short walk of the building site. Nothing was purchased. Nothing was transported over long distances. Nothing required specialized manufacturing. Branches and saplings for the frame. Grass, reeds, leaves, and bark for the covering. Sometimes animal hides layered over the top in colder climates. Occasionally, mud packed into the walls for insulation. Think about what this means economically. The house had a material cost of essentially zero. It cost only labor, and only about an hour of it. There was no debt, no saving up, no specialist you had to pay. A young couple starting out didn't need to inherit a home or spend years acquiring one. They could simply build one that afternoon, wherever they happened to be. Compare that to a modern human who may spend a substantial fraction of their entire working life paying for shelter. The prehistoric housing market had no prices because the raw materials were everywhere and the only currency was a couple of hours of skilled work. There's a detail here that most people miss, and it's important. Building these shelters was skilled work. It looks simple, sticks and grass, but knowing which branches bend without snapping, how to weave a frame that won't collapse, how to thatch so the rain runs off instead of soaking through, how to orient the doorway away from the prevailing wind. All of this was expertise, accumulated over generations and passed down. And in most hunter-gatherer societies, this expertise belonged to women. Among the Hadza, it is the women who build the huts. The knowledge of shelter construction was part of a vast body of practical technical skill that doesn't show up in the archaeological record, because it lived in people's hands and heads, not in permanent structures. So when we look at a simple grass hut and think, anyone could do that, we're wrong. Anyone couldn't. It only looks effortless because we're watching a master at work. And now, a question I genuinely love you to answer in the comments. Have you ever built something with your own hands that you actually used? A shelter, a piece of furniture, a shed, a treehouse, a repair on your home, anything where you made the thing that then sheltered or served you. How did it feel to use something you built yourself versus something you bought? I have a suspicion about the answers, and I think this one's going to spark a great conversation. Drop it below. Now we come to the real question, the interesting one. If these people were skilled enough to build good shelters, and they clearly were, why didn't they build permanent ones? Why not a solid house of stone or timber that would last for decades? The answer is not that they couldn't. The answer is that it would have been irrational. And understanding why reveals the entire logic of the hunter-gatherer way of life. The key concept is mobility. Hunter-gatherers move, frequently. The Hadza relocate their camps roughly every 2 to 6 weeks. They move when the local food is depleted, when the water source shifts, when game moves on, when the season changes, or sometimes simply when they feel like a change of scenery or need to resolve a social conflict by separating. Now apply simple economic logic. If you're going to abandon a location in 3 weeks, how much should you invest in your house there? The answer is as little as possible while still meeting your needs. Investing 20 hours or 200 hours in a structure you'll walk away from in a matter of weeks would be a catastrophic waste of effort. Building something functional in 1 hour isn't laziness, it's optimization. It's the correct answer to the actual problem. They didn't build permanently because they moved every few weeks. Investing 200 hours in a house you'll leave in 20 days is irrational. 1 hour is the correct answer. This connects to something even deeper, the entire philosophy of possessions among mobile people. When you move your entire household on foot, every object you own becomes a burden you have to carry. This creates a powerful, built-in pressure toward minimalism. Not minimalism as an aesthetic choice, like a modern person decluttering their apartment, but minimalism as a hard survival logic. A permanent house is the ultimate uncarryable possession. It anchors you to one spot. And for a hunter-gatherer, being anchored to one spot is not security, it's a trap. It means when the food runs out, you starve rather than move. It means when conflict arises, you can't separate. It means when the environment changes, you can't follow the change. Mobility was freedom. Mobility was survival insurance. And a permanent house is the enemy of mobility. So the disposable, 1-hour house wasn't a limitation they suffered under, it was a tool that enabled their entire flexible, resilient, mobile way of life. The house was designed to be abandoned. That was the point. When the Hadza leave a camp, they take almost nothing from the huts. They might take the thatching grass because good grass can be hard to find, but the frame is simply left behind to rot and be eaten by termites. The house returns to the earth, and at the next site, they build again, from scratch, in an hour. No waste in the deepest sense. The house was borrowed from the landscape and returned to it. For mobile people, a permanent house isn't security, it's a trap. It anchors you when survival depends on being able to move. But here's where it gets fascinating. Because prehistoric humans did sometimes build substantial semi-permanent structures, and looking at when they did tells us everything. Consider one of the most remarkable structures in all of prehistory, the mammoth bone houses of the Ice Age. At sites across what is now Ukraine, Poland, and the Czech Republic, the most famous being Mezhirich in Ukraine, archaeologists have found dwellings built from the bones of mammoths. Not a few bones, hundreds of them per structure. Circular buildings, roughly 4 to 6 meters across, their walls constructed from stacked jaw bones and massive leg bones, entrances arched with tusks, the whole thing covered with hides and turf. These were not 1-hour huts. Even in a dry state, large mammoth bones weigh hundreds of pounds each. Assembling several hundred of them into a single structure required enormous coordinated effort. These were serious buildings, dated to around 18,000 years ago, during the coldest, harshest phase of the last ice age. Why did these hunter-gatherers suddenly invest all that effort? Because the environment demanded it. In that brutal glacial landscape, trees were scarce. There was little wood to build with. Winters were savage and long. A flimsy grass hut would not keep you alive through an ice age winter on the open steppe. When survival required a heavier structure, and when people were staying in one place through a long, hard season, the calculation flipped. Now the investment was worth it. This is the crucial insight. The level of investment in shelter always matched the length of stay and the harshness of the environment. Prehistoric humans weren't primitive builders incapable of permanence. They were rational builders who invested exactly as much as the situation required, and not 1 hour more. The Ice Age mammoth bone houses prove it. When the environment was harsh and the stay was long, they built heavy. Investment always matched need. And now, the great comparison, the one that changed everything. What happened when humans stopped moving? Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in several places around the world, humans began to farm. And farming changed the housing equation completely, because farming ties you to the land. You can't plant a field, tend it for months, harvest it, and store the grain if you're wandering. Agriculture demands that you stay put. You must live beside your fields. You must guard your stored harvest. You become, for the first time in human history, permanently settled. And the moment humans settled, permanent housing suddenly made sense. If you're going to live in the same place for years, for a lifetime, for generations, then the economic logic reverses. Now it's worth investing hundreds of hours in a solid house of mud brick, stone, or timber because you'll get decades of use out of it. The house becomes a long-term asset instead of a disposable tool. The early farming villages, places like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, show us this transition. Dense clusters of permanent mud brick houses, packed tightly together, built to last, rebuilt on the same spot generation after generation. People were now living their whole lives in one place. But this transition came with a hidden cost, and this is something worth sitting with. The permanent house solved one problem and created many others. Once your home was fixed in place, you couldn't leave when the local resources were exhausted. So people began to exhaust and degrade their environments. You couldn't walk away from your own waste, so permanent settlements brought sanitation problems, and with them, disease. Living packed together with animals and stored grain brought rodents, parasites, and new illnesses that had never troubled mobile people. And the permanent house, full of stored food and durable possessions, created something mobile people never really had: accumulated wealth. Some houses were bigger than others. Some families stored more grain than others. For the first time, your dwelling became a marker of status and a store of inheritable wealth. Many anthropologists link the settled, permanent house directly to the origins of durable inequality. The mobile hunter-gatherer, with a house they could rebuild anywhere in an hour, was, in a sense, freer and more equal than the settled farmer in a permanent home. The one-hour house left almost nothing to hoard, nothing to inherit, nothing to fight over. When humans settled, the permanent house became a store of wealth. Bigger houses, more storage. Many trace the origins of durable inequality to this moment. Let's go a little deeper on the engineering itself, because it deserves respect. The dome shape used in so many hunter-gatherer shelters, from the Hadza huts to the Kung grass shelters of the Kalahari to countless others, is not an accident. The dome is one of the most structurally efficient shapes that exists. It distributes force evenly, sheds water and wind, encloses the maximum internal space with the minimum material, and has no weak, flat surfaces for wind to push against. Modern engineers rediscovered these advantages and called it the geodesic dome. Prehistoric humans arrived at the same solution through generations of trial and error, with nothing but branches and grass. The choice of materials was equally sophisticated. Green, living saplings for the frame, because they bend into curves without snapping and hold their shape as they dry. Grass thatch layered at an angle, because water runs down the individual blades and off the structure rather than soaking through. The whole thing raised slightly or sited on a gentle slope, so rainwater drains away rather than pooling inside. None of this is written down anywhere in the prehistoric record. It was encoded entirely in living tradition, knowledge passed from hands to hands, generation to generation. A body of architectural science with no textbooks, no blueprints, no engineers with degrees. Just accumulated human intelligence refined over tens of thousands of years, capable of producing a perfect small building in 60 minutes. There's one more type of prehistoric shelter worth mentioning because it breaks the simple hut versus house division: caves and rock shelters. Where nature provided a ready-made shelter, a cave mouth, an overhang, a rock shelter, prehistoric humans used it, and used it repeatedly across thousands of years. This was the ultimate efficiency, a durable, weatherproof dwelling that required zero construction. Many of the most famous prehistoric sites, from the painted caves of France and Spain to rock shelters across Africa and the Americas, were exactly this: natural architecture, occupied again and again by mobile groups who returned to the same reliable spot season after season. Notice the logic is identical. When the landscape offered a permanent shelter for free, people took it. When it didn't, they built a temporary one in an hour. Either way, the principle held: get exactly the shelter you need for the least possible cost. Caves weren't a primitive phase humans grew out of. They were simply the smartest option wherever they happened to exist. Let's also correct a misconception, because it matters. We tend to imagine prehistoric people as either living in caves or in these flimsy huts, and we picture both as miserable, cold, and desperate. But the ethnographic evidence tells a different story. These shelters worked. They did the job they were designed to do. A well-built grass hut in a warm climate is cool in the day, private, and perfectly comfortable to sleep in. In fact, many hunter-gatherers, including the Hadza, often prefer to sleep outside next to the hut entirely, using the structure mainly for storage, privacy, shade, and shelter from the occasional rain. The hut was a tool with specific functions, not a cramped prison they were forced to endure. There's a kind of arrogance in assuming that a small, temporary, natural home means a poor quality of life. For a mobile people in a suitable climate, that hour-built house was exactly enough. Not too little, not too much. Precisely calibrated to need. That's not poverty. That's a kind of wisdom our own overbuilt, overmortgaged, overcluttered world has largely lost. The shelters worked. Cool, private, comfortable. Many hunter-gatherers even preferred to sleep outside. Enough is not poverty. It's calibration. So let's pull the whole picture together. The prehistoric hunter-gatherer built a home in about an hour, from materials that cost nothing, using skilled knowledge passed down over generations. They built lightly and temporarily, not because they lacked the ability to build permanently, but because permanence would have been irrational for a mobile people. Their disposable house was a precision tool, perfectly matched to a life of movement. When the environment demanded more, as in the brutal cold of the Ice Age, they built heavier, as the mammoth bone houses prove. Investment always matched need. And when humans finally settled down to farm, the permanent house was born, bringing comfort and durability, but also disease, environmental degradation, wealth accumulation, and inequality. The solid house we think of as the mark of civilization came with a bill attached, and we are arguably still paying it. There's something almost philosophical in the hunter-gatherer's approach to shelter. Build what you need, use it, let it go. Carry nothing you don't have to. Stay free to move. Take from the landscape and give it back. Their houses have long since rotted into the earth, leaving barely a trace. And that impermanence, that lightness of footprint, was not their failure. It was the entire point. The next time you look at your own home, with its mortgage, its maintenance, its endless accumulation of things, it's worth remembering that for the vast majority of human history, Home was something you could build in an hour and walk away from without a backward glance. And the people who lived that way were not poorer than us in the ways that matter most. In some ways, they may have been richer.